Welcome. My name is Holly. I'm Program Manager at Edison Ford Winter Estates. And this month we're talking about Charles and Ann Lindbergh in Southwest Florida. And here I am in front of them because they both were aviators. This did not take place in Fort Myers, but I thought it was a pretty cool picture and that you would enjoy seeing it. So let's get this started. Charles and Ann Morrow Lindbergh in Southwest Florida. And to set the stage, I do have to talk about their lives outside of Southwest Florida, but I'm going to be focusing on what happens in our area here and actually other parts of Florida as well. Charles Lindbergh was born in Detroit, Michigan on February 4th, 1902. His family moved to Little Falls, Minnesota when he was a toddler, and he also spent much of his childhood in Washington, D.C., where his father, Charles August Lindbergh, was a U.S. congressman from 1907 to 1917, who opposed the U.S. entering World War I. And you might want to keep that in the back of your mind, how he was raised. But again, remember also my primary focus is on Southwest Florida. As a child, Lindbergh showed exceptional mechanical ability, and at 18, he enrolled in the University of Wisconsin to study engineering. However, he was more interested in flying than he was in school. So after 2 years, he left college to become a barnstormer, doing tricks, traveling the country. In 1924, he enlisted in the United States Army so he could be trained as an Army Air Service Reserve pilot. He graduated first in his class, and he was also commissioned as a lieutenant in the Air Service Reserve Corps. And at that same time, he's also employed by the U.S. Post Office for mail delivery. In 1919, a New York City hotel owner, Raymond Ortega, offered $25,000 to the first aviator to fly nonstop from New York to Paris. Several pilots were killed or injured while competing for the money. By 1927, 8 years later, it still had not been won. Lindbergh believed he could win it if he had the right airplane. He convinced 9 St. Louis businessmen to help him finance a plane. And Lindbergh, I say here, Lindbergh chose Ryan Aeronautical Company of San Diego to manufacture a special plane, which he helped design. But there were lots of other companies that I didn't mention in here that turned him down. And he named the plane Spirit of St. Louis. And you can see why, because it's the St. Louis businessmen that help him to finance this plane. On May 10th through 11th, 1927, Lindbergh tested the plane by flying from San Diego to New York City with an overnight stop in St. Louis. The flight took 20 hours, 21 minutes, a transcontinental record. On May 20th, Lindbergh took off from Roosevelt Field, New York, in the Spirit of St. Louis at 7:52 a.m. He landed at, I'm going to try to say this correctly, the Bourget Field near Paris on May 21st, 10:21 p.m. Paris time, 5:21 p.m. New York time. You can't see them all, but it was a mob scene. There were 150,000 people who had gathered to meet him. He had flown more than 3,600 miles, 5,790 kilometers in 33 and a half hours. And I have different accounts of how long he was awake for, anywhere between 55 and 63 hours, including the Distinguished Flying Cross Medal from President Coolidge, and also the way it was designed so that he could actually have an extra fuel on the plane. He wasn't actually able to look straight ahead. It was kind of a funky setup, but he was also used to looking out the sides when he did other things in planes, but it was not easy at all. And all of a sudden, he is a nationwide hero. And I read that people were pulling him out of the plane and carrying him around in Paris. And keep this in mind that all this Lindbergh wasn't a person that necessarily wanted all this fame and this treatment. Charles devoted much of his time promoting aviation. He flew to different cities where he gave speeches and participated in parades. At the request of the United States government, he flew to Latin American countries in December 1927 as a symbol of U.S. goodwill. And while in Mexico, he met Anne Spencer Morrow, the daughter of American ambassador to Mexico. Lindbergh married Anne Morrow in 1929, and I believe it was the first woman he ever dated. He taught her to fly, and they went on many flying expeditions throughout the world, chartering new routes for airlines. And I'm assuming this heavy gear, my husband would be able to tell me, I should have, but it's because the plane was not heated and it was pretty darn cold. And she became quite the aviator herself. And that's a picture of her as a younger woman. I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. Anne Morrow Lindbergh was born in Englewood, New Jersey on June 22nd, 1906, to Dwight Whitney and Elizabeth Reeve Cutter Morrow. Her father, the future ambassador of Mexico, and from 1930 to 1931, the Republican senator from New Jersey, which I'm assuming he just was filling in because that's a short term, was a lawyer and partner in J.P. Morgan and Company before entering public service. Her mother was an educator and acting president of Smith College in 1939 to 1940, and she was also a poet. So you understand the environment she was brought up in, a little different from Charles. A shy, quiet child from a young age, Anne wrote plays and discovered through writing her own personal connection with the world. And that's how she interprets the world, is through her writing. In 1924, she entered Smith College, where she majored in English. She graduated with prizes in creative and expository writing. And Anne and Charles met on December 21st, as I mentioned before, 1927 in Mexico City. Her father was Lindbergh's financial advisor at J.P. Morgan and invited him to promote good relations between Mexico and the United States. And of course, they meet, fall in love, get married. Anne was Charles Lindbergh's first romance, and they became engaged after only 4 days. They were married at the home of her parents in Englewood on May 27, 1929. Charles Lindbergh taught Anne to fly and she helped open piloting to all women. That year, she piloted her first solo flight. She also learned Morse code and radio communications so she could serve as his co-pilot on their aeronautic explorations. The National Geographic Society awarded its Hubbard Gold Medal to Anne Lindbergh in 1934 for accomplishments in 40,000 miles of exploratory flight over 5 continents with her husband. A year earlier, she had been honored with the Cross of Honor for the U.S. Flag Association for her part in the survey of transatlantic air routes. In 1993, Women in Aerospace presented her with a Special Aerospace Explorer Award in recognition of her achievements and contributions to the aerospace field. And Anne Morrow Lindbergh was also the first licensed woman glider pilot in the United States. And I don't think her contributions get nearly enough credit. Oh, I did it. I put that on top of the writing. Searching for a quiet life away from the spotlight, Charles and Anne moved to a home in Hopewell, New Jersey. The couple started a family with the birth of their child, Charles Augustus Jr. When he was 20 months old, and I'm sure you've all heard of this story, he was kidnapped from their home in 1932. The crime made headlines around the world. The Lindberghs paid a $50,000 ransom, but weeks later, their son's dead body was found in the nearby woods. And I love this picture of her. I could see her delight in her son. And as parents, most of us, or just as humans, I'm sure we can feel their pain. And that's just my supposition that two things helped shape Lindbergh besides his childhood, and that would be landing in Paris to the throngs of people who were pulling and tugging on him, and the loss of their child, which definitely affected their relationship in the future. The police traced the ransom money to a Bruno Hauptmann, a carpenter with a criminal record, and arrested him for the crime. The trial of the accused killer became frenzied. Hauptmann was convicted and later executed in 1936. And yes, there are people that don't believe he was guilty. The Lindberghs did. The Lindberghs had 5 more children. John Lindbergh, he was born in 1932, Land Morrow Lindbergh, 1937, and Spencer Lindbergh Perrin, 1940 to 1993. And so she passes away when her mom is still alive. I can't imagine the pain of losing another child. Scott Lindbergh was born 1942, and the youngest daughter, Reeve, born in 1945. And yes, we are getting to Southwest Florida. I just wanted to set the stage for the rest of this story. To escape the limelight, the Lindberghs moved to Europe. They really, and especially after the death of their child, they wanted to be away from the limelight in the United States, constantly being harangued by reporters. They lived in England and France, and Lindbergh does some scientific research helping to invent an early type of artificial heart with the French surgeon, Dr. Carrel. I think I'm saying his name correctly. He also continued his work in aviation, serving on the board of directors for Pan American World Airlines, which is no more, and acting as a special advisor. Lindbergh was invited to tour German aviation facilities by Nazi leader Hermann Göring and was impressed by what he saw, the technology that they had. And Göring presented Lindbergh with the German Medal of Honor. The US ambassador was there as well. And Lindbergh's acceptance of the medal caused an uproar in the United States because people could see the path that they were headed down. Lindbergh said he thought it would have been rude to refuse it and that he was able to gather more information that way. But it was definitely a controversial moment. And when things began to change for the way Lindbergh was treated by the press, the Lindberghs returned to the United States in 1939. In 1941, he joins the America First Committee, an organization that opposed voluntary American entry into World War II. And remember what I told you about his father in World War I, and that is America First gathering that he is speaking at. Lindbergh became the leading spokesman for the committee in Des Moines, Iowa in September of 1941. Lindbergh made a speech that would be even a greater downfall. There were 3 groups pressing the country towards war. He stated the British, the Roosevelt administration, and the Jews. So he was denounced as an anti-Semite. The debate, and I have no answer for why he said that because he always claimed he wasn't, but he did say those words. The debate surrounding US war policy came to an end on December 8th, 1941, the day after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, though he resigned his military commission in 1939, and though he was opposed to the war, when he knew that it was inevitable, he was eager to fight for his country, and the president refused. Obviously, they did not have a good relationship. And here is Charles Lindbergh and Henry Ford. Lindbergh first met Ford in 1927, and that is not when this photo is from, but when he landed at Ford's plant's private airport in Detroit in the spirit of St. Louis. He was surprised when he asked whether Ford would like to fly, and Ford agreed. And then this is a 1-seater plane, so he had to sit in a crouching position in the 1-seater plane, but the flight was very successful. And Ford, by all accounts, enjoyed it. At the end of December 1939, they resumed their acquaintance. In June 1940, Lindbergh persuaded Ford to back an American Legion campaign against American involvement in the war. And if you recall, Henry Ford had a peace ship in World War I, and which he went on to oppose entry in World War I. Later that same month, Ford overruled his son Edsel, who was now running the company. Well, he tried to when his father didn't interfere. And he halted a lucrative federal government contract to produce 6,000 Rolls-Royce engines for British fighter pilots and 3,000 engines for American warplanes. And by the way, Henry and Edsel had gone to the White House and agreed to it, and then Henry changed his mind. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese on December 7th, 1941, brought an end to Lindbergh's opposition to the war, which I previously stated, and to the work of America's First Committee. Lindbergh hoped to return to the armed services, but after his opposition and his remarks, that was refused because he had publicly resigned from the Army Air Corps. Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson questioned Lindbergh's loyalty, and he refused to allow him to return. We're getting there. We're getting close to Southwest Florida. Henry Ford hired Lindbergh as a technical advisor at Willow Run. Willow Run, the plant that Charles Sorensen and Edsel Ford developed, but I do believe that Henry hired him for that. And this is at Willow Run, a plant that produced B-24 Liberators and will actually beat all records on assembling them by the end of the war. In 1943, Lindbergh, so he does test things and advises them at Willow Run, but in 1943, he joined United Aircraft and also chaired the Aeromedical Unit for Research and Aviation Medicine at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, in order to help advance high altitude flying. And he was kind of used as a guinea pig for them as far as medical tests, the effects of the body on flight. In 1944, Lindbergh persuaded United Aircraft to call him a technical representative in the South Pacific to study aircraft performances under combat conditions. This is interesting. In 1944, without the knowledge of the White House or the Secretary of the Navy knowing, Lindbergh left for the South Pacific, and he arrived in New Guinea in late April, 2 months after leaving the United States. Though he was a civilian, Lindbergh would fly on dawn patrols, join rescue missions, and flew any combat mission that would get him on the front lines. And he taught young pilots multiple ways, from what I learned, how to conserve fuel, which was very precious and rare over there, and fly longer range missions. But he was basically acting as a pilot for the government, though they didn't know it. And when Lindbergh left the South Pacific in September 1944, he had participated in 50 combat missions without the knowledge of the government. So now we're going to get to him in Southwest Florida. I know that's a little hard to read, but what's interesting to me is that this is from Fort Myers Tropical News, and I can't find the original newspapers online, but way back in the day here, somebody apparently typed these all out by hand. So I put it up here, and there's a nice picture of Mr. Lindbergh. And this starts but it's kind of upside down. So I'm going to start at the bottom. February 5th, 1927 edition of Fort Myers Tropical News, which is not in print anymore. Prior data to Vanna to prevent Lindbergh's visit to Fort Myers. Cables Mrs. Edison, he'd like to come, but he can't make it. Lone Eagle, one of his nicknames, sends regrets in reply to invitation to birthday party for Wizard. Lindy's cablegram to Mrs. Edison, Western Union cablegram, San Juan, Puerto Rico, February 4th, 1928. Mrs. Thomas A. Edison, Fort Myers, Florida. Greatly appreciate the invitation, but must be in Havana until 13th. Would be glad to make special trip to Fort Myers if schedule allows stop. Please convey my serious admiration and best wishes to Mr. Edison. So he's not going to make it to Fort Myers then. And then a year later, February 4th, 1928 edition of Fort Myers Tropical News. Lindy can reach Fort Myers from Cuba in 3 hours. Colonel Charles Lindbergh can fly from Havana to Fort Myers on February 11th for Thomas Edison's birthday in less than 3 hours, aviation enthusiasts said yesterday after reading of the proposal to invite the intrepid flyer here. Lindy will get to Havana Wednesday, and by Saturday the 11th, he should be ready to take off and in less than 3 hours land here, Deputy Sheriff Roy E. Larson declared. I don't know if Lindy agreed to that. A study of maps and charts shows the distance from Havana to Fort Myers to be about 250 miles on an airline. In the spirit of St. Louis will travel an average speed of more than 100 miles an hour. The Chamber of Commerce was preparing yesterday to draft a formal invitation to Colonel Lindbergh, which will probably be cabled to him today. Well, that's only a week before Edison's birthday. Doesn't seem like a lot of time to me. So what happens here? And I actually missed that one above because these are all in weird order. And they invited him, basically, it says, to Edison's birthday party. They had a conference to consider it. And they're saying that Fort Myers would hit the front page of every newspaper in the country if we could put it across. So a little publicity wouldn't hurt Fort Myers either. And on the February 5th, this one is in order, 1928 edition of the Fort Myers Tropical News. Colonel Charles Lindbergh would like very much to make a special trip to Fort Myers to attend the city's birthday party for Thomas A. Edison, but he can't make it. The Lonely Eagle cabled his regrets yesterday to Mrs. Edison, who had sent him a message in San Juan, Puerto Rico, which is interesting because it actually was supposed to be the Chamber of Commerce, asking him to stop off here on February 11th for the celebration the city is giving in honor of the inventor's 81st birthday. He has been booked in Havana till February 13th, so I'm not quite sure if that was the right date. It might have been the 1927 date. Lindy said, and the schedule does not permit a special stop here on his homeward hop. His cablegram was sent yesterday before he left San Juan on his own birthday for a flight to Santo Domingo. Lindy gives out news. Word that Lindy received an invitation from Mrs. Edison and that Fort Myers wanted him here for the wizard's birthday was given out at San Juan yesterday and sent to the United States in news dispatches. Until that time, Mrs. Edison had kept her message to the flyer secret from all but a few intimate friends. And again, the dates, I believe, get mixed up here, but you get the idea. They tried a couple of years in a row. She was hoping to have a happy surprise for Mr. Edison in the lucky event that the Lindbergh would find it possible to accept it. When she received the message from the Colonel last night, she permitted James D. Newton, also known as Jim or Jimmy Newton, to make it public with the expression of regret that Mr. Edison would not be able to have as his guest the young man he so greatly admires. And keep that Jim Newton name in mind, because that is going to be in the future, the biggest Fort Myers connection, Southwest Florida connection that the Lindberghs have. Like his friend and neighbor Henry Ford and the rest of the world, the wizard is a great Lindy fan and follows all of the Lone Eagle adventures with keen interest. So he never makes it here. But what's interesting is that I found on a website, it said that Lindbergh was on his way home from Havana after finishing a tour in the spirit of St. Louis. He flew over the Edison home, dipping his wings. And there is no proof that that ever happened, but I found a couple of places where they did report that. And this just shows Edison there. I can't find good pictures that are that I can use, but there's some from Getty Images and a couple other places where we'll have Lindbergh here and Edison in the same photo. So they did meet, but probably not in Fort Myers ever. Skipping ahead, and there's going to be more Fort Myers connection forthcoming. The Lindberghs met James Newton in 1937. Now realize this is 1928 when they're hoping for Lindbergh to show up, and James Newton is there helping to orchestrate Edison's birthday party. But they met through their mutual friend, Alexis Carrel, the Nobel Prize winner in 1912. He's a doctor and a surgeon for his work on the suturing of blood vessels and transporting transplanting organs. In the 1930s, Carell and Charles Lindbergh became close friends because they worked together and also because they shared political and social views. And Lindbergh originally sought out Carell to see if his sister-in-law's heart, Anne's sister, damaged by rheumatic fever, could be repaired. And there's a picture of the two of them together. Together, they devised a machine for supplying a sterile respiratory system to organs removed from the body. Lindbergh solved the mechanical problems involved because he knew of those type of things because of being an aviator. And so those two men worked together. And Carell, you'll hear his name, but he wasn't as well known during the time period, except in certain circles, but very well known for his work with the heart. And he and Lindbergh work on it together. And eventually James Newton, or Jim Newton, will meet the Lindberghs because of Dr. Carell. According to Tom Smoot, the author of The Edisons of Fort Myers, the Lindberghs were dinner guests at Seminole Lodge, that's the Edisons' home, each year when there were no other guests but them and Mina Edison. They had become friends with James, or Jim Newton, who was a friend of the Edisons. Smoot interviewed Jeanette Perry, who was Mrs. Edison's secretary. Mrs. Perry said that Fort Myers came to respect the privacy of the Lindberghs, while the Lindberghs remained aloof and cautious. But she claimed that they did dine with Mina Edison. Unfortunately, there are no pictures or anything other than Mrs. Perry, who I believe obviously is telling the truth, but that's the only way we know about it. And Tom Smoot also in his book writes about, the Edison, 1 year, not both years, that they were hoping that Lindbergh would be able to at least fly over or attend the celebration, but that did not happen. So I would suggest that you read The Edisons of Fort Myers. There's a couple of pages about Lindbergh. James Newton met Charles Lindbergh through Dr. Carell at a dinner in 1937, where he shared his faith with Lindbergh. Lindbergh did not have a strong faith. I do not believe he was an atheist, but he also wasn't a strong believer, though he always listened to James Newton, very devout Christian. The following year, Newton spent time with Lindbergh and Anne and their children. And they not only talked about faith in God, science, obviously, and morality and philosophy and a lot of other topics. In January 1940, sensing that the Lindberghs needed to get away, Newton rented Anne and Charles a cottage on the island of Captiva, a remote island over only 7 miles long off the Gulf Coast of Florida. And that information is from the Captiva Island Historical Society. I also did find some things in the newspapers that I'll be showing you shortly. At that time, it was only reachable by boat. I don't think the Sanibel Causeway was built till 1963, the first one. So it was truly a remote place, and somebody had drawn a little sketch that's in the public domain of their cottage that they used on Captiva, and most likely the one that Anne Morrow Lindbergh used to write her book, which I'll talk about shortly. And this is from the Fort Myers News Press, January 24th, 1940. And before I go on, I want to say that Uncommon Friends, the book by James Newton, talks a lot about Lindbergh. And it's a great resource. He does write it near, I think it comes out in 1985. He dies in the late 90s. So when he was a little more mature. So for example, he'll say some dates for this was 1941, but I could tell he meant 1940 because later on he'll talk about 1941 separately. And if you look at the newspapers, that is when the Lindberghs come to Captiva for the first time. And I'll read this to you. And this is from the Fort Myers News Press, January 24th, 1940. I relied on James Newton's book and the newspapers and whatever else I could find for this, using a few more newspapers than I normally do. Colonel Lindberghs Visit Captiva planned cruise expected to leave soon for Shark River Country, Rent Island Cottage for season. Colonel and Mrs. Charles Lindbergh were located at Captiva Island yesterday, where they have rented a cottage for the season. During the afternoon, they went sailing with James Newton in his small 18-foot sloop, but because of unsettled weather, called off, at least for a few days, a proposed cruise to the 10,000 Islands in Shark River country. The Lindberghs arrived at Captiva late Monday with Mr. Newton after a trip across San Carlos Pass across the Kinsey Brothers automobile ferry. It was established that Mr. Newton went to Haines City, which later on the Kansas City Royals had their spring training there when they leave Fort Myers, baseballs and boardwalk, Monday to meet Mr. and Mrs. Lindbergh, despite reports from his parents at Fort Myers Beach that he was out on a sailing trip. So they are trying to keep this very secret and respect their privacy. Newton had previously rented one of the Dickey cottages on Captiva for the Lindberghs, and I couldn't find that before. That one didn't make the newspapers. He tried to surround their arrival with deep secrecy, but the Lindberghs did not attempt to conceal their presence either on the train or after their arrival. Newton said late yesterday that the Lindberghs did not care to be interviewed or have any pictures taken. The cottage, which the Lindberghs will occupy on Captiva for several weeks, is a modest frame structure halfway between the beach and the bay. Mr. Newton is staying with them and has his small sailboat there for sailing trips. While on a trip to aboard for the Oxford movement, which is what Mr. Newton was part of, and then it becomes the Morrow rearmament. And I'll just briefly explain that that's a modern non-denominational revivalist movement founded by American churchman Frank Buckman. It sought to deepen the spiritual life of individuals and encourage participants to continue as members of their own churches. And it involved a lot of things to do with morality, had a lot of conferences, was pretty well known in the 30s and 40s. He first met Lindbergh at Dr. Alexis Carrel's estate off the coast of France, where the two were experimenting with a mechanical heart after Lindbergh's return to this country, and it is understood the present visit is the result of Mr. Newton's glowing account of the Lee County waters. On leave from the Firestone Company for duty, he was with them for 8 years. He does not return. With the Oxford group, Mr. Newton usually spends a summer and winter vacation at the beach. He has property interests there as well as elsewhere as the original developer of Edison Park, along with his father. And then his father takes it over when he goes to work for Firestone and still owns some of that subdivision. First reports that the Lindberghs were in Florida had it that they were headed for Fort Myers Beach, but instead they went direct to Captiva. Staying on Captiva, they will be members of a small winter colony numbering several well-known writers and scientists, including Ding Darling, cartoonist and conservation leader. And you get the idea. But that's the first thing that we see in the press. And it even makes the wire service the following year when they come back. And they did get to do some sailing despite some rocky seas. They did sail further down into Florida. So in 1941, this is on the AP wire service, and this particular one was in the Atlanta Constitution. Colonel Mrs. Lindbergh sail on fishing trip, Fort Myers, Florida, March 8th. Colonel and Mrs. Charles A. Lindbergh sailed yesterday with James Newton of Fort Myers Beach, an old friend. And I don't think he actually was living there at the time, but maybe he was staying with his parents briefly because he's going to go in the military, which friends said might extend to the dry Tortugas 40 miles west of Key West. It actually does extend there. They were aboard Newton's 32-foot ketch, Marlin, which won the 1935 St. Petersburg Havana yacht race. I love this one. After Colonel Lindbergh grounded on Bonita Beach sandbar after navigating around the world. The Charles Lindberghs ran aground on a sandbar yesterday, bringing their 32-foot sailboat into the protected waters of Big Hickory Pass out of the rough Gulf Seas. Colonel Lindbergh even jumped overboard in the shallow water in a vain effort to keep the ketch, Marlin, off the bar. Their plight was of short duration, however, because Colonel Lewis Hogue and Charles Weeks, fishing guides, came to the rescue and with a cruiser from Frank McLaughlin's Bonita Springs fleet, pulled them back into deep water E.M. Strong, manager of the Bonita Springs Development Company, saw the Lindbergh craft run aground and called the cruiser to aid them. That just seems a little ironic, though I know he was known for his feats in the air and not on the ground or in the water. And Mr. Strong said the colonel was so pleased with the good fishing, he planned to remain at Bonita for several days before continuing his fishing cruise down the Southwest Florida coast. And Sheriff Fred Roberts, hearing of the incident, dispatched State Patrolman Walter Whitehead to give the party any assistance needed. When Whitehead arrived, the ketch was safely anchored at deep water, and the colonel assured the patrolmen that no assistance was needed. Colonel and Mrs. Lindbergh are guests on the cruise of James Newton of Fort Myers Beach, who owns the Marlin. On their return from the fishing trip, the Lindberghs plan to spend several weeks at Fort Myers Beach, as they did last winter. Though actually last winter they were, which according to the newspaper, that last winter they were actually in Captiva. And then this goes on in 1941 to say that the Lindberghs and James Newton, who have been cruising the Gulf Coast aboard the Marlene II, a 38-foot ketch put in yesterday at Morrow, which is a much more remote spot than for gasoline and groceries. They have spent some time in the 10,000 Islands and Shark River country and have gone far south as Tortugas near Key West. So yes, they went to the dry Tortugas. They visited Fort Jefferson. The Lindberghs and Newton left the beach in the face of small craft warnings and went aground on a sandbar off of Bonita Beach, but continued after their sailing. Craft was floated with the help of commercial fishermen. And we'll be wrapping up 1941 shortly, with Mrs. Ann Lindbergh at the helm and Colonel Lindbergh helping Jim Newton handle the sails. The Marlene coasted into San Carlos Bay and went through the draw of the Fort Myers Beach Bridge to tie up at Powers Point just after sunset yesterday afternoon. The Lindberghs with Mr. Newton have been cruising the lower Gulf for 2 weeks aboard the Marlene, which is a tidy motor sailor, which formerly belonged to Kent Curtis of Captiva and was recently acquired by Mr. Newton. Because they wanted to do their own navigating, the Lindberghs and Mr. Newton, who they visited here last year, left without a guide in the face of small craft warnings. We're going to rub that one in, and this is still the Fort Myers News Press, by the way, but were set afloat again by fishermen and returned in Sanibel. They started down the coast of the Shark River country and sailed down the Keys to Key West. On the return trip, they stopped at Morrow. It's pretty repetitive, and they were not seen to unload anything but personal baggage when they docked at the bay side of Estero, better known as Fort Myers Beach. Last night, they made themselves scarce and could not be reached by telephone, but it is presumed that as long as they stay at the beach, the Lindberghs will be at the home of Mrs. John W. Power, and Mrs. Power has a comfortable bayside home, which can be seen from the bridge. She has rebuilt several houses at the beach, is now developing a residential subdivision in the middle of the island. We're going to skip way ahead. Long Eagle, also Charles Lindbergh, and Newton, James Newton. I'm talking about him again in 1985. I think that's the year his book comes out, or close to that. Became friends with Dr. Carrel, who receives a Nobel Prize for his work in physiology and medicine. And he became close to Lindbergh in 1930, working with him in developing the artificial heart, a Pyrex device that sustained live organs outside the body during surgery, rather than internally like today's Jarvik 7 artificial heart that beats in the bodies of two gentlemen. And this is 1985. So realize this is like 47 or so years old. And Dr. Carrel said, you two must meet. And he arranged a dinner one night in a little French restaurant. We became friends right away. That's Newton speaking. Charles had known Carrel very well, so we met under the best of circumstances. I liked his straightforwardness, his deep interest in people and life. So many don't get that from personal news stories. He once said, fame is a form of death. It meant you aren't a real person to so many when you were famous. And of course, I think he also meant he lost his child because they knew of that baby because he was famous. His sincerity impressed me, his genuineness and the sense of integrity and interest in deeper things, the spiritual things. And it was his questioning mind, his inquiring mind. You just lean forward and listen to him. From that point on, Newton saw him quite often. I was living in New York and he was living on Long Island. In 1940, Newton first brought Lindbergh to Lee County in one of his frequent visits home. I brought him to Captiva. Then we bought this 32-foot yawl and called it the Alder Baron. The press reported as a different name, but apparently they had changed it. And apparently other places, I get the idea that they owned this boat together. We take trips 2 to 3 weeks at a time. So this is interviewing James Newton, I believe, in conjunction with his book coming out. We went to uninhabited parts, the Shark River and the Everglades, the Tortugas, the Keys, kept the boat upriver. We took quite a few trips. Sorry about the noise. Somebody somewhere is drilling. The three of us, including Lindbergh's wife, Ann. And yes, they did have children at home that would have been with a nanny. With that guy, we were always on the move. But 42 years ago, the three became four when Jim and Ellie Newton married in Washington, D.C., culminating a friendship that became a romance when she accompanied her friend Mina Edison on a trip to the West Coast. So that's how that got started. Their best man was Charles Lindbergh, and Newton's wife was quite a few years. He was in his late 30s, and she must have been close to her mid-40s by the time they married. The best man was Charles Lindbergh. He told me he didn't like to go to weddings. Newton said he'd only been to 2, his own and then mine. The 4 friends got together often at locations worldwide. Anne Morrow Lindbergh wrote her book, A Gift from the Sea, in 1945 after a stay on Captiva, one of many visits to this area. It was a close friendship, but the numbers dropped back to 3 on August 26, 1974, when Lindbergh died of cancer at his vacation home, I guess they're saying, on the Hawaiian island of Maui, but he actually had become a legal resident by that time. The last time I saw him was in the hospital before he went to Maui. He died. And I still miss him, Newton said, but I talked to Anne, who lives in Connecticut, and they would visit the area, she and her family, and see them as often as possible. And Charles Lindbergh was the last of his famous friends to pass away. But as with the others, he left James Newton behind as a legacy. And this, most of this information, in my own words, is from the Captiva Island Historical Society. The Lindberghs returned to Captiva in 1948, staying in a cottage rented by their friend Jim Newton. And Anne observed how little had changed on Captiva during their 8-year absence. In January 1950, Anne chose Captiva to find refuge from her public life and obligations and returned to the island on her own. The people of Captiva remembered Mrs. Lindbergh would sometimes dine on Signe Whiteman's homestyle cooking at the island store. That's not there today. And was known to, on occasion, have an evening meal at the Twin Waters dining room, where her need for privacy was honored. And this is picture probably earlier time period. During the day, and this credit, the first paragraph is from the Captiva Island Historical Society's website. During the day, Anne could be seen on Captiva's beach with a notebook in her hand, penciling reflections, which would later become the body of the book, Gift from the Sea, the most celebrated of her more than 24 literary works. On her time alone in Captiva, Mrs. Lindbergh recalled, "You sink into a more authentic place inside yourself. I collected shells. There was nothing else to do on an island like that. I recognized how wonderful the freedom was of being able to go into a room and just write what one feels." And it's philosophical when she talks about the shells and compares it to life. I think it's about 124 pages. This is the first edition cover of the Gift from the Sea, an answer to the conflicts in our life, it says. And Gift from the Sea was published in 1955. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for a whole year and has sold more than 3 million copies through 2005. And that's when they do their anniversary edition. A special 50th anniversary edition of Gift from the Sea was published in 2005. And the beach that she would visit when she's there is no longer there, according to one of the author of a book about her. But you can still get the feel a little bit for what it would have been like to be on that remote island during that time. And there's so much about both Lindberghs. It could go so in depth about their life. I can't do that all. So I just try to give you a little overview and then focus on their visits here. And that book is still sells well today. It has a different cover, a blue cover, but it's very popular. The Lindberghs continued to visit the area through the 1950s, including visits to the Fort Myers Beach Hotel Jim Newton's parents ran, and his father had helped him with the development of Edison Park. And they also had a hotel there, Fort Myers Beach, that the parents ran in later years. When Jim and Ellie Newton returned to Lee County, where Jim had once lived, Fort Myers Beach, they would visit them. And Charles had been their best man at their wedding in 1943. Jim was in the military for several years. After Charles' death, the Lindbergh family continued to visit at the Newton home, Seven Seas Cottage. And there's a picture of it. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Scott Berg, who wrote the book, Lindbergh, visited Jim Newton on Fort Myers Beach to interview him. And the author of a book on Anne Morrow Lindbergh also quotes Jim Newton. He's probably the best source that we have for information about the Lindberghs, and both of their biographers include information about Jim Newton and their time around this area. And Anne Morrow Lindbergh wrote the book, the introduction to Jim's book, Uncommon Friends. That is their home. It is owned by the town or city of Fort Myers Beach, I think is a town, and actually is available to rent out. And the Lindberghs, I mean, the Newtons for a while had been, they had been working for the Morrow rearmament, so they did not have a lot of money, but he does come back to Fort Myers Beach, forms a real estate company, and they will live there till their death. Jim will die in the late 90s, and Ellie a few years later. I think he lives to 94 and she lives to like 101 or something like that, and they're quite beloved. So both of their biographers mention Jim Newton, not necessarily Captiva, Fort Myers Beach, but we know that that's where they're from and that they visited there. Charles Lindbergh will die on August 26, 1974. I think he had lymphoma at the age of 72 in, I'm not going to say this right, Kipahula, Hawaii. They still had a home, I believe, in Connecticut. And Jim Newton does get to visit at the Lindbergh home up north. I can't remember if it was New Jersey or Connecticut, and then visited him in the hospital. And then they are going to transport Lindbergh by plane. I think they arranged it with TWA. Their son Land went with them, and so he could die on the island there in Hawaii. And there's a I wish I'd put it here, but there's a on his stone is a verse from Psalms, which for a non-traditional believer, it was interesting about the wings of morning. Mrs. Lindbergh will live much longer, and she dies on February 7th, 2001 at the age of 94 at oh boy, I'm going to butcher this, and I'm from New England, Passaumsic, Vermont. I believe she was living, she had a little home on the property of her daughter, Reeve Lindbergh. And quite a few years ago, Reeve Lindbergh spoke at Sanibel Library, which was a real thrill. Sincerely said to hear her speak. She spoke about her parents. She's very open about them, about their lives and what had happened in them. And she's an author in her own right, because my children had a book written by her, like it was about a farm. I think it was called Midnight Farm, a children's book. She was the author, and then someone else did the illustrations. And she has done some writing of her own. She wrote a book about her mother's last years after she had a stroke called No More Words. And she goes, she's the one that's most had been most available to the press. I believe she had a friend on Sanibel that she used to visit. I don't know if she still comes back. And for a few, by the way, Lindberghs become very involved in conservation work. And I believe for a few years, their fund would, I wasn't called the Charles Lindbergh Fund, but there was a fund that would raise money for such things. And in 2006, the year after I started here, and I wish I had been able to go to it, they had a seminar. Lindbergh's granddaughter spoke about him. It was held on the grounds. They made a big deal about that, that they had visited, that the Lindberghs both would have been familiar with the home. And I think that's the last year they had it, though I could be wrong, and I just didn't find any more clippings about it. So the last thing before I go to the last page, because I know that's a question in people's mind, though this is not in any way, shape, or form the focus of my presentation, I did want to say that, yes, after Lindbergh's life, it came out that he had other families. Reed Lindbergh talked about it. He was a consultant to the Air Force and Pan American World Airways. And in 1957, then he was 55 and he fell in love with Brigitte Heschheimer, a 31-year-old hat maker living in Munich, Germany. They have a secret long-term affair that only ended with his death in 1974. They will have 3 children. I've read different amounts, visits once or twice, 2 or 3 or 4 times a year, introducing himself to the children as Mr. Carew Kent. He was also involved with a secret long-term relationship with her sister, Marietta, and then there was a third woman, Valeska, Lindbergh's German translator and private secretary, and he has 2 children with each of them. So he had 3 families. And 10 days before his death, he wrote letters to the 3 women asking them to keep things secret, and they did, until the first family, the one that has talked to the press and things, Brigitte, children after the mother died, they started speaking to the press. The other 2 families have continued their silence and not given any interviews, but the 3 children broke their silence. And there was a book that came out in Germany about the double life of Charles Lindbergh. And Reeve, the youngest of his children, wrote about the revelations of her father's infidelities and about connecting with her European brothers and sisters, and an essay published in her book, Forward from Here, Leaving Middle Age and Other Unexpected Adventures. And I'll just leave with this quote. I said, I had the feeling he was the only person involved with all these families who knew the full truth. And I keep thinking by the time he died in 1974, my father had made his life so complicated that he had to keep parts separate from other parts. I don't know why he lived this way. I don't think I ever will know. But what it means to me is that every intimate human connection my father had during his later years was fractured by secrecy. And what I do want to also say is, if you've ever watched the movie with Jimmy Stewart as Charles Lindbergh flying to Paris, a very moving movie. I know it's historic fiction, but there's some truth in it. I would encourage you to do that. There's some great biographies. I'll bring up my sources now. Captiva Historical Historical Society has some information about Anne Morrow Lindbergh. There's a biography of Charles Lindbergh online. There's the homepage, charleslindbergh.com. There's the Charles Lindbergh home in Minnesota. And there's things the Smithsonian has, of course, because they have the Spirit of St. Louis there. And check those out. Uncommon Friends by James Newton, a great source. The Edisons of Fort Myers, Discoveries of the Heart by Tom Smoot. Anne Morrow Lindbergh, Her Life by Susan Hertog, who was not a biographer. I don't know how she ever got Anne Morrow Lindbergh to agree to it, but it's an interesting resource. Lindbergh by A. Scott Bird. I had tons of other books, but they didn't really mention James Newton or by association this area, so I kind of focused on that. Next month, Gettysburg Eddie, September 13th at 10:30. There's my email, hshaffer@edisonford.org. Who's Gettysburg Eddie? Just real quickly. Sometimes my baseball ones don't get as much viewing because you're thinking, why do I care about that? Well, Gettysburg Eddie was a pitcher for the Philadelphia Athletics, and they're here from 1925 to 1936. Now, he was with the earlier years. They have 2 different editions of award winning teams. And he was an amazing pitcher. He's in the Baseball Hall of Fame. But back then they didn't make enough money. He has to go back to Gettysburg. He had graduated from Gettysburg College and start a garage and work as a battlefield guide. And his story is actually some ways sad. And I'd really like to share it with you. And I encourage you, even if you're not interested in baseball, I know you're all interested in history, so join me. So on that note, I'll look at the question and answers. Will this recording or the slides be available to rewatch? If so, could I ask where to find it? Thank you for a very interesting and informative presentation. If you want me to send you the slides, I will. Otherwise, it is going to get posted on YouTube today, this afternoon, so you can watch it then. I don't see any other questions or comments. So you're the reason why I do this, and I do love history. I always worry about some technical issue, but please join me next month. I look forward to seeing you all, and I thank you for your support, and see you next month. Thank you.